what he's referring to is when I was 14 years old, and I wanted to get a copy of Fawn Brodie's book, Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate History. I joined the Book of the Month Club. Now, at 14, 14-year-olds are too young to make a contract, obviously. So my parents, these books kept coming every month, and my parents were like, what happened here? So eventually they explained to the Book of the Month Club what the problem was, and they canceled this non-existent contract. You know, 4 books for $1. You know, I had $1. You know, that's what you could do. So that's what he meant. That's what he's referring to. Well, I don't think I probably didn't know that I wasn't supposed to make a contract, but in any event, that's what he's referring to. This has been, and thank you for coming out. I was astonished by the gas thing. My escort was driving along what I realized was a major thoroughfare in Atlanta, and every time I've been here before, it's just traffic, 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 and it was like a speedway. We were just sort of going along, and I thought, where is everybody? And that's when she explained to me that there's a problem with gasoline here, and hopefully it will be over very, very soon as the pipeline gets flowing and we get places from my native area, Houston, Texas, to get the gas here that you guys need. This is a long journey for me, as my anecdote at the beginning suggests. I became interested in Jefferson as a topic when I was in the 3rd grade, and I read one of those child's biographies of Jefferson. And I didn't know anything about the Hemings family until I read a copy of my parents' book, White Over Black, by a very eminent historian, Winthrop Jordan, who just died recently, one of the most famous books about slavery. And in it, he had a chapter called Thomas Jefferson, Self and Society, and he talks about Jefferson and his attitude about race, and he mentioned the Hemings family, and I thought, this is interesting. This is not the kind of thing that was in my sort of age-appropriate biographies of Jefferson. And Jordan's portrayal of this was pretty balanced. He didn't say it happened or it didn't happen. He was just talking about the Hemings family in general and about slavery and the subject of interracial sex and mixed-race children in slavery. And so I read that book and thought that this was interesting. And then a couple of years later, I heard about Fawn Brodie's book, when her book came out in 1974. And she was a much embattled figure because she wrote about the Hemings family. Unlike Jordan, who was sort of looking at it in an analytical way and just discussing the issue, she wrote about it as if it were part of Jefferson's life. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, and just sort of went forward. And of course, she was excoriated for that. And I remember seeing her on television as a somewhat embattled figure. I kept up my interest in reading about Jefferson. I was interested in Jefferson. People asked me, what is that about? When I first read about him, I felt a connection because he loved books. And I loved books. And so, you know, the part about him being a slave owner, okay, that's problematic. Those things are there, but the idea of a person who loves something as much as I did was very attractive to me. And so I was able to sort of compartmentalize this other stuff and focus in on that. And somebody who also, his curiosity about everything in the world, I thought was attractive as well, then and now. I mean, who was interested in everything and who wanted to try to find out everything he could while he was here on Earth, as much as he could about the world around him. I found that attractive because that's the way I was and am too. So there was that point of identification, and I was also interested in the founding of the country, the idea of starting anew and starting a place, a country. This is sort of an aside, and the reason I sort of thought about this is my father, who passed away last year, was, I guess you could say, somewhat eccentric. He always wanted a country for black people. He wasn't really sure that this was actually our country, that it would be better if we were somewhere, if blacks were somewhere, where we could have our own leaders, we could have our own presidents and so forth, the things of that nature. So in my household, this notion of founding a country or nationalism had this peculiar bent to it because I'd heard my father talk about that in a completely different context. So the notion of founding a country and the kind of people who do that and the kinds of ways they set things up, the laws, all of the culture, all those things that you have to get together if you're starting a country, interested me then and interests me now. I teach at Rutgers, and my class is about the early American Republic. And even though my focus, my specialty in scholarship is slavery, one of my students came up to me sheepishly last year and said, Professor Gordon-Reed, are we going to talk about slavery in this class? Because I had been sort of off into Hamilton and Jefferson and, you know, the Assumption and all these kinds of things that have to deal with the beginning of the Republic, and had sort of, we did talk about slavery. I mean, that was a big part of the class, the second part of it. But those kinds of things interested me as well. And I continued to read about Jefferson through the years. And when I was in college, I thought about doing a paper about Jefferson and Hemings, writing about this subject matter. And my professor said, oh, you can do better than that. And I remember that phrase, you can do better than that. That was just an old abolitionist story. That was the story that was told by the abolitionists to make, pretty much to make Jefferson look bad. So I was trying to get into the law school of my choice. And when a professor tells you a subject is worthless, you don't do it, right? So I wrote about, picked another topic, enslaved women in women in slavery and their lives in slavery. And I took the WPA narratives and compared their lives in Georgia and Texas and so forth. So it turned out to be a good subject matter. But I've often said I'm glad that my professor told me not to do it, because I might have gotten it out of my system, and I wouldn't have written my first book. So I thought about going to become a historian, where I could study my love of history and writing and sort of do it as a profession. I was told mistakenly that, well, I was told, and the mistake was that, well, there are too many graduate students. There's a glut of historians. So what they didn't tell me is that there's a negligible amount of black PhDs in history. People would have loved to have me come to their program, because black people go to law school, medical school, other kinds of things, rather than, there are black historians, but comparatively, it's really, we tend to go to business schools, things like that, rather than law school. But I thought, well, I don't have to do that, because if you love books and you love history, you can read books in history all you want. You don't have to do it professionally. But I found over the years that I really wanted to write about it as well. It is not just consuming it. I wanted to write because there were things that I had to say. And what gave me, and I came out of law school, went to work as an associate in a law firm. And if anybody knows what that's like, that's not a place to have sort of extracurricular activities. You're supposed to be billing hours. And if you're not billing hours, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. And you're not going to make partner. And I wasn't sure I didn't even know what, I went to a law firm because that's what people were doing. I wasn't really sure. That's not why I went to law school. I went to law school because, again, I didn't go into history, but I thought law was a profession where you could kind of change the world, and I wanted to do that. And that's not what law associates do, right? Changing the world is not in the job description. And there's no room for extracurricular activities. And I tried writing on my own and eventually found that didn't work. I changed jobs and finally came to the point that I said, I should go into academia. A friend of mine said, you want to write? You can go into academia and you should have your chance to write. So I went to work in academia. My sole criteria was that my school had to be in Manhattan, which severely limited the range of places I could go. But I got a job and started working there. And, I started on a law review article, which is what law professors are supposed to do. New law professors, you're supposed to crank out a law review article. And in 1995, I read that there was going to be a movie called Jefferson in Paris by Merchant Ivory, and it was going to revisit this issue of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings in the context of this movie. And there were all of these stories about how outrageous this was, that there was no evidence that this happened, and that Jefferson wouldn't be involved with a slave girl. And I found myself a little, insulted by the idea, a slave girl, as if every African-American woman in slavery was exactly the same. From 1619 to 1865, you say slave girl, you know exactly what that is meant. The idea that there was no evidence, well, I remembered in Fawn Brody's book, at the back, there was a memoir of a man, or recollections of a man named Madison Hemings, who said he was the son of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and an enslaved man named Israel Jefferson. His real name is Gillette. And in my book, he's described as Israel Gillette because that was his real family name. Jefferson was just sort of tacked on there. And they talked about this. Now, people may not have believed that what they said was true, that it was proof, but there's a difference between evidence and proof. That was certainly evidence of a relationship. whether you accepted it as the truth or not. But to say that there was no evidence was like saying these people had never spoken. That, you know, that's, I mean, I remember I came across this letter from a planter who's writing to someone, and he said, you know, I just thought that was Negro news. In other words, Negro news meant to connote something that was fanciful or meaningless, or something that had no rhyme or reason to it. And so I thought this sort of back-of-the-hand treatment, you may not, those two statements may not have proved it, but it was certainly evidence of it. And it was evidence that I thought, given the nature of slavery, should have been looked at. I mean, if you think about it, when people who are living under systems of oppression in any other context, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who died recently, when he came out of the Gulag and said, here's what happened, people listened to him. They gave him the Nobel Prize for telling the truth about what was happening under the Soviet regime. He was given a measure of respect. And it struck me as odd that people coming out of the system of slavery, which was a system of oppression, people were prevented from telling their life stories. They were prevented from, or writing their life stories down, certainly, or going into court and bringing paternity, anything like that. They were denied access to all of that. So when people come out of that system and they say something and they get the back of people's hand because they're saying something that's not popular, I just thought, wait a minute, this is a flip of everything that the West is supposed to stand for. You know, when Kennedy goes to Germany and says, I'm a Berliner, and everybody goes crazy because, and claps, because the idea is that people in the West are supposed to see the world through the eyes of the oppressor. And we certainly don't see it through the eyes of people who are enacting the oppression. I mean, from Magna Carta all the way to, you know, you construe a deed against the person who drafted it. You know, if a person has the power to create the document, if there's going to be an interpretation of it, we're going to do it on the side of the person who didn't have that power. That strain of being concerned about people who take too much power to themselves doesn't apply with enslaved people. They were, and very often in history, have been treated as people who are the aggressors. You know, that they're saying things that are trying to make these people look bad, all right? So that was really what motivated me. I mean, the idea that a slave owner had children with an enslaved woman on his plantation, growing up in East Texas, I mean, that didn't strike me as a big deal. I mean, that was something that happened. If you go to a black family reunion, the people there will be all the colors of the rainbow, all different shades. And very often, as it is in my family, the older the people are, the more fair-skinned they are. Because the mixing, there was more mixing going on. People talk about Barack Obama as if he's some new thing, a half black, half white person. Wow, where did that come from? Well, that's never happened in the history of America before. And so it's like, what are you talking about? That this is some newfangled thing. They've done sort of spot DNA checks of black males in certain communities throughout the South, and sometimes upwards of between 33 and 45% of them have European Y male chromosomes. I mean, that's 33 to 45, that's the men. Now, we'll talk about the Y chromosome later, but the Y chromosome is the chromosome that all men have, that makes you a man, and it passes down from your father to son, all down the generations. So, but it doesn't go, obviously, women don't have a Y chromosome, so that doesn't even account for women. It doesn't account for, say, slave owners who had a daughter, or slave owners who had a son who then had daughters. They wouldn't have it. So that's a huge percentage of people we're talking about here. So to portray him as though we've entered some sort of new world of mixed race liaisons and stuff like that is just really, really bizarre. But in any event, so it never struck me as an odd concept. What I wrote the first book about was to talk about how black people are written about in slavery. So while I was writing this book, I always had it in my mind that I wanted to do a biography of Jefferson, but while I was writing the first book, it occurred to me, well, one of the problems is that people don't really know that much about enslaved people in general. I mean, slaves are written of sort of almost in an abstract way. It's like a concept, a generic enslaved person. I think it's easier to make a connection to someone, to feel a connection to someone when you know something about them, you know? And when you have that connection allows for empathy. as opposed to pity. And when you pity someone, you're putting that person outside of you in a way. When you empathize with someone, that comes from a sense that there but for the grace of God go I. There's something about this situation that is familiar to me. And then you come to the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But it's easier to sort of not do that when the person is the other. It's some unfamiliar thing. And I said, well, you know, Jefferson was this inveterate record keeper. He made lists of everything. He had a farm book, which lots of slave owners had, which was basically the details of their farm operations, the list of slaves, when they were born, you know, who they were married to and their families and so forth. Slavery was a business, and businessmen keep records. But he also kept something called the memorandum book, which was a record. This is something that people don't do, except I think maybe Bob Graham, the former governor of Florida. He wrote down every single thing, every transaction that he made during the course of a day. Now, obviously, there were times when he did not put things down. But, you know, from the time he's a young man in his 20s up until his death at 83, we have a daily list of where he is. And today I bought, you know, 3 shillings for snuffers. You know, this many shillings for this, that, and the other. And in it, he also has, you know, records of his dealings with the Hemings family. You know, I gave Betty Hemings a tip, or paid her this much for chickens, you know, or sent James to buy shirts or whatever. So you can track some of the Hemings family, certainly James Hemings and Robert Hemings, Sally Hemings, his older brothers. You could track them on a day-to-day basis for long periods of time based upon his memorandum book. So, and then, of course, there are all of his letters and his family letters and so forth. So there's I thought, well, there's lots of information about these people. I think it would be a good idea. Put Jefferson, the biography, aside for a second, even though one of my friends, who's a great champion of mine, is a history professor at the University of Virginia, Peter Onuf, says, no, do the Jefferson biography first. I decided that I really wanted to do this first, that it was important to get a handle on his life, get a handle on Monticello, and certainly the Hemings families are key to a life at Monticello, and to tell their individual stories. And it is a long book, but I hope a satisfying book, a readable book. It's divided into 3 parts. The first part of the book is called Origins, and in the first 6 or so chapters there, I introduce Elizabeth Hemings, who was the daughter of an Englishman and an African woman who was born in the Williamsburg area. And since I know when Elizabeth was born, I know where she was born, I know she was owned by the Epps family, a prominent family in Virginia. I know those sort of legal details about her life. But what I have to do more, what I try to do in this book is to evoke the world that she lives in. And the first chapter of the book is called Young Elizabeth's World. And it talks about the Williamsburg area, Virginia, in the 1730s, a time when more Africans were brought into Virginia than in any other decade in history. It was a place that was a mixture, almost 50-50, of white people, mainly of English origin, and Africans. And when I say Africans, keep in mind Africa is not one country, even though some people refer to it that way. There are multiple countries, multiple ethnic groups, and the people who were in Williamsburg, you would have been walking around seeing black people who were Creoles, and when they say that, they mean sort of cultural mixtures of people who had adopted English, maybe even Christianity. But there would also be blacks who spoke different languages, people who had their tribal scarring marks, people who were Muslim, some people who'd adopted Christianity even before they came to America in Jamaica or in other places where they did what that was called seasoning. So it's very easy. When you go to Williamsburg today, it's sort of hard to get that sense. I mean, Williamsburg is very white, and you sort of understand, you know, not a lot of black people want to dress up and walk around, you know, just being sort of the local color, if for lack of a better term, in this place as enslaved people. Doing reenactments is one thing, but to get the feel of what it looked like to be in a place that's almost half black and half white, with these people speaking different languages, with the English people and Irish people with accents, it's not It's not what we think of today. And so that's the world that she's born into. It's a world where it's getting the slave system in order, getting everything, the sort of codifying slavery and sort of moving from, and one of the first things that I talk about they did in coming from England was to change the rule about status. In England, you were what your father was. And when they come to America and they're putting the slave system together, they switch and they become Roman. Parta sequitur ventrum, birth follows stomach, but it really means birth follows the womb. You were what your mother was. And you can kind of see how important that is to the maintenance of a slave society. If they'd kept the old rule, the English rule, any white man who had a child with a black woman would be producing a free-born child. And so they switched that and made it through the mother. And it's easier, it has been easier to control women and control the sexuality of women than men. And men can have many, many more children than women anyway. So that old English rule presented a problem, and they fixed that. And because Elizabeth Hemings' father, just because he was an Englishman, it meant nothing, right? I mean, he would not have the right to her. She would not be freeborn and was not freeborn. And so for that fateful decision, all of her children would become enslaved people. So I introduced her. I introduced Johnwales, who owned her when he married into the Epps family, a woman named Martha Epps, and came into the ownership of Elizabeth Hemings and many other slaves. Johnwales, who I see as a part of the Hemings family, at some point after his third wife dies, takes Elizabeth Hemings as a concubine. Johnwales was a fascinating man. You know, he is written of, and I write in my first book, relying on Tyler's Quarterly and the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography, all those old, things that you have to be wary of, that he was trained as a lawyer in England. He was not. He was actually a servant boy who was brought over by a man named Philip Ludwell. And, he is sort of a complete cipher in most Jefferson biographies. Well, there's a big difference between, for Jefferson's wife, being the daughter of someone who is trained as a lawyer, and which would point to at least a middle class or an upper class background, even though there were some farmers' sons who did come to the bar, and being a servant who was raised up, and because he was very, very intelligent and very creative, was given a great position in society and amassed a lot of wealth that Jefferson inherited when his wife died. Well, so when I'm putting Jefferson into the story too at this point, because he marries Martha and brings the Hemings family. That's how the Hemings family comes to Monticello in 1772, some of them, and then 1774 and by 1775, all of them are there. And because Jefferson lived a very long time, and because the Hemings family were, to use a term, favored among the enslaved people on the mountain, they lived in this place pretty much intact as a family for 50 years. And that's something that that's the other thing that helps with reconstructing their story, because many slaves' families were broken up. And in fact, some of the people at Monticello, when Jefferson sold people, he sold mainly people from other plantations. Monticello is just one of his plantations. But he sold people from other plantations, mainly from Bedford, his Bedford estate. So the Hemingses have an intact family for decades. They're living on the mountain, working with one another, and so it doesn't really, they're not like the sort of picture of the fractured slave family that you have particularly after the Revolution and after the end, when they really stop bringing in large numbers of Africans, and we start getting the internal slave trade, when people are sort of being transferred from Virginia down to Georgia, down to Texas, down to Louisiana, and out to Kentucky and places like that. So you get the sort of internal slave trade going, but they are not a part of that. And because they're in this one place, as I said, it's easier to have a sense of who they are and maintain a sense of them as a family. So they are installed as the sort of favorite house slaves there. I talk about the Revolution, America and the Revolution, and their connection. The Hemingses have some connection to that. Some of them were taken from one of Jefferson's plantations to Yorktown. And when Jefferson leaves Monticello, flees Monticello, which he should have done. I mean, there's a lot of criticism of Jefferson for fleeing before the British coming up his mountain, as if he was supposed to stand against Tarleton's troops. by himself when he's the governor, but he left, which he should have done. It made sense. But who's left there is Martin Hemings, and we talk about his dealings with the British during that time. And the first section ends with the death of Martha Jefferson, Jefferson's wife, a cataclysmic event in Jefferson's life. And he decides at this point that he's going to go to France. He's going to accept a commission to go to Paris, which he had declined 2 times before because his wife had been ill. And he wanted to get away from it all. This was a terrible tragedy for him. The governorship, he'd been governor, war governor, and that had gone very, very poorly. And so he wanted to get out. And when he does that, this begins the sort of dispersal of the Hemings family for a time. Elizabeth Hemings' older sons, Martin and Robert, remain in the United States, and they go off to work for themselves. Jefferson had allowed them and continued to allow them. When he was away from Monticello, they sort of went away and hired themselves out and got to keep their wages. So they were used to having a sort of, but they had to come back when he called them. So they had a life in Fredericksburg and Richmond and places like that, working on their own and keeping their money. So when he goes to France, Martin and Robert continue to do that. He takes James with him to have him trained as a chef. And the second part of the book is called The Vaunted Scene of Europe, which is a Jefferson phrase when he's writing to Charles Bellini, saying, now I'm going to talk to you about the vaunted scene of Europe. The vaunted scene of Europe is about James and Sally Hemings in Paris. James training to become a chef in some of the best kitchens in France by a man who worked by a cook in the Prince de Condé's kitchen. The Prince de Condé was a member of the royal family, their family seat was a place called Chantilly, which probably fit 5 or 6 Monticellos into it, had a stable for 280 horses. I mean, you get a sense of what this place was like. And to imagine, being a young man from Virginia, any young man, white or black, slave or free, going to see a place like that, a chateau like that, and seeing that type of opulence that led to the French Revolution. But that's another story. It's another story to tell altogether. But then Sally Hemings arrives a couple of years later when Jefferson's younger daughter, she had been sent to live at Eppington with Jefferson's 2 younger daughters because he thought they were too young to make the trip over. And one of the daughters died, and Jefferson said, I don't want to live without my other daughter. I want her brought to me. And he asks his sister-in-law, Elizabeth Epps, to send his youngest daughter, his now youngest daughter, to Paris with a woman named Isabel Hearn, who was an enslaved woman who was about 28. And so she was supposed to be the older, sort of mature woman. For whatever reason, the Eppses decide to send Sally Hemings instead of Isabel Hearn. Sally Hemings is about 14 years old at this point, and they make the transatlantic voyage by themselves. Well, obviously they're a captain and ship, but I mean, they don't go with a chaperone per se. So they're there under the charge of the captain. They go to London and spend 2 weeks in the home of Abigail Adams. And I talk a little bit in the book about why I think that was probably a scary experience for Sally Hemings. But then they go on to Paris. And Sally Hemings, we don't really know, I mean, for the first year, she's not getting paid. She begins to get a salary the beginning of the second year that she's there. Before this happens, she is sent away for about 40 days to be in isolation because she had to be inoculated against smallpox. And I have a chapter that talks about that process and the process that she underwent, where she went and all of those kinds of things. And sort of imagine being, a 14 or 15-year-old person who's sent away to a country that you don't know the language, and you're sent away to the French countryside, and you're in isolation, and you're given smallpox, because that's what inoculation was, giving people a milder version of smallpox. She was treated by a man named Robert Sutton, who was one of the famous members of the famous family of inoculators, a man who had come to France to try to save King Louis XV, who had smallpox, but there was no saving the king. So this is the man who inoculated Sally Hemings, and she's off at his inoculation house, and I talk about that. And I talk about what Paris was like in the 18th century for black people. One of the things, people tend to talk about James and Sally Hemings in Paris as if they're in Virginia. It's like they never, they never left Virginia. I mean, we talk about Jefferson, and we know he's in Paris, and they talk about the life and all this. They were in another place with different laws, a different culture. There was a black community in Paris, not a large one, but it was a small community that tended to be situated in 2 or 3 neighborhoods. And it happened to be the neighborhoods that Jefferson was in, with the Hotel de l'Angioc in the first place he lived as well. So these are people, they're not there by them. They're not in Virginia, nor are they in Paris. It's the only black people there. So I talk in this section, the vaunted scene of Europe, about Sally Hemings and going out with Jefferson's daughters to balls and various things as her lady's maid. And I broached the subject of a beginning of a relationship, or whatever, we can talk about that, between Jefferson and Hemings in Paris. And according to her son's recollections, she became pregnant in Paris, and I have a chapter when I get into the 3rd section explaining why I think that's so. The evidence that she did have a baby in 1790, but the baby died. And I talk a little bit about that. This is a question about slavery, it's a question about gender, and I spend some chapters going over that, trying to discuss my feelings about that. And my editor calls those analytical chapters. Because up until now, it's a narrative. But then when I come to that, I just don't think I can just stop at that point. I have to talk a little bit about slavery and life for enslaved women. And one of the questions that people ask me all the time is, why would James and Sally Hemings come back here to slavery? I mean, I would say, forget about it. I mean, you're going to stay in Paris. And I think that in my, when you're writing these things, you have your sort of fantasy about what you would wish would happen. Is like, don't go to the theater, Mr. Lincoln. Something like that would happen. You can step in and stop stuff from happening. And obviously, you can't do that. I mean, I sort of wish that at some level Jefferson had said, there are no slaves in France. That's the phrase. It wasn't exactly true, but every slave who filed a petition in France in the 18th century was granted freedom. Hundreds of petitions. The French did not want slavery on French soil. Didn't mind it in the colonies. Very lucrative colonies, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saint-Domingue, just made fortunes for people. But not in Paris, not in France proper. They did not want it. And so, if he had said, you guys stay here. I will help you find a position. His secretary, William Short, stayed in Paris after he left. You can work for Mr. Short. You can come see your family anytime you want to. But that didn't happen. So that's like, Mr. Lincoln, don't go to the theater. That's something that you can't control. But they come back. The story is that he convinced Sally Hemings that she would have a decent life and her children would be freed. She didn't have to worry about partus sequitur in other words. And so she's 16, and you could easily, I think, convince a 16-year-old of something. And that's why they came back. She also had a family here. James and Sally Hemings had a family in the United States. And one of the great dilemmas for enslaved people was, do you stay in this system, or do you try to take freedom as an individual on your own without your family? And so I can understand how it would be one thing to think about staying in France and staying in freedom, but on the other hand, this family, it was very, very closely knit. You look at the family tree that I have in the book, and they're naming each other after each other. I mean, you think about how people who don't have law to maintain their families, what kind of things do they do? And one of them is naming people after one another. Sally Hemings' name was really Sarah. And you look at it, and they're Sarahs. She was an important person in her family, as you can tell. She was a baby sister. A baby sister is a big deal in African-American families. And she's, there's Sarah. Her nieces and nephews are named after her. And so I could see why it would be hard to think of never seeing your family members again. So the vaunted scene of Europe ends with them coming home. Then I have a section called On the Mountain, which is not technically on the mountain because there's a lot of traveling going on. Members of the Hemings family are going with Jefferson to Philadelphia when he's Secretary of State. They go with him to, and they actually go with him to New York while the capital was briefly there. James Hemings gets his freedom in 1794. Jefferson said, look, I've spent lots of money having you trained as a chef, and he really did. So what you need to do is to train somebody at Monticello to be a French chef, and then I will give you your freedom. And that's what happened. So he leaves slavery. The first person to leave slavery is Robert Hemings, who moves to Richmond with his wife and 2 children and continues to have relations with Monticello. He visits Monticello. He corresponds with Jefferson. The Hemings brothers were literate. We don't know about Sally Hemings and her sisters because there's no pieces of paper. But the brothers were literate, and literate at a fairly high level, from judging from James's writing. Robert Hemings's letters are no longer extant. We don't know where they are. So Jefferson, the record keeper, kept a list of every letter that he wrote and every letter that came in. It's called the SJL, Summary Journal Letters. And so you can tell on what came in and what went out. So we see all of Robert Hemings's letters to Jefferson and Jefferson's letters to Robert Hemings, but they're nowhere to be found. So that's the other kind of thing historians hate, you know. I would love to see those letters. But so On the Mountain covers Jefferson's time, the Hemings' time with Jefferson in the various capitals. Talk about the whole scandal that breaks in 1802 when James Callender exposes Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. And we talk about Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston Hemings and their life at Monticello, Sally Hemings' kids. And to the end, when Jefferson dies bankrupt, $107,000 in debt. $107,000 in 1826 is a lot of money. It sounds like today, for God's sake. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what happened. Did the package pass? Oh, no one's going to have any money to pay anybody. Oh well, okay. So much for liquidity. But in any event, wow. Oh, okay. Hey, you know, I'm stunned. Okay, so Jefferson dies, $107,000 in debt, and people are auctioned. There's an auction at Monticello, and enslaved people are sold along with furniture and all kinds of things. Sally Hemings and her sons move into Charlottesville, and her brother, the other Wales children, all of the 6 children, well, Robert is dead by now. James died much earlier, but after he was freed. And of course, so it's Critta and Thenia and Sally and Peter who are left, and all of them end up. Well, Critta is bought by her by one of her cousin, I guess, Frances Epps. All these convoluted situations. She's bought, and she goes to live with her husband, who's a free man in Charlottesville, in the Charlottesville area. The other Peter Hemings and Sally Hemings end up listed as free people on the 1830 census. And in 1833, there's a special census done in Virginia to go around and ask free black people if they want to go back to Africa. And this was in the sort of heyday of the American Colonization Society. And Sally Hemings says, no, you know, I don't want to go back to Africa, as if she'd ever been to Africa. It would make, it'd make it more sense to send her back to Lancaster, England, much less Africa. But she doesn't want to go back, and the sons don't go back. She's described as a free mulatto who lived in Charlottesville since 1826. So the sons are freed formally. The 2 older children, Beverly and Harriet, leave Monticello to live as white people and are not formally freed. And you can kind of understand, if they wanted to live as white people, it wouldn't make any sense to give them freedom papers, because then people would know that they were part black. And so they go off, marry white spouses, and they are sort of lost to us. I mean, every now and then I get letters and stories from the descendant of Harriet or from the descendant of Beverly. No, actually the descendant of Harriet. There are lots of people who, who feel that they may be descended from Harriet Hemings. Not so much that I know of from Beverly Hemings, the older son. So I end the book with the sort of dispersal at Monticello, and with the story of Joseph Fawcett, who was a Hemings, who was a grandson of Elizabeth Hemings, who is freed in Jefferson's will, but his wife is not freed, and none of his children are freed. So he spends the next several decades buying back his family. What he had done was ask members of the white Charlottesville community to buy some of his children, promising that he would buy them back when he got enough money. And he was in the process of doing that, but there was one man who refused to sell his son Peter, who was 12. I mean, he had the money for it, but he just wouldn't sell. And so at some point, Fawcett believes that Virginia is too, this is after Nat Turner, and it becomes a very, very hostile place, even more hostile place for free blacks and enslaved blacks. He decides to move to Ohio. So he makes one more chance to get Peter, and he refused. The ending to this, any of this could be happy. Peter eventually gets his freedom, but he's an adult by then, and he moves out to Cincinnati with his father and mother, and they're rejoined, and he becomes a caterer and a minister, and the family becomes very, very active in the Underground Railroad, spiriting people to freedom. So I end with that story. I am going to pick up the Hemingses in the 19th century, and I will start there, and then this is all sort of in the epilogue, but I will pick up with their story, follow them out to Ohio, talk about their lives, what their activities in the Underground Railroad, some of the others, Johnwales Jefferson, who is a grandson of Sally Hemings, and Beverly Jefferson, who become prosperous businessmen in Madison after their father decides to leave the black community and go into the white world. And Johnwales Jefferson is a fascinating man who becomes a lieutenant colonel in the Civil War. We have Jefferson's grandson, who was for a time Jefferson George Wythe Randolph, who is for a time the Secretary of War for the Confederacy. We have Madison Hemings' sons who fight for the Union, and as black people, and Johnwales Jefferson and his brother who live in the white community fighting for the Union. So you get a sense from that just how the war separated this very odd family and very, well, I mean, strange family, the types of families that we don't think about. So there's just too much in the 19th century for me to sort of tack that on to this already very, very long book, but readable. Long book. Long book, because I just didn't want to give short shrift to that, because there's just so much there with these people remaking themselves after the war is over, after Reconstruction, and everybody's just sort of creating, in the North and the South, creating new identities and doing different things with their lives. So my point in all of this, my hope in all of this, was to try to, not to do away with social history. You know, social history, the history of groups, or writing about enslaved people as a group, that's very, very important. But I've never been one of those people who thinks, okay, it's either this or it's that. You know, you either have to be doing social history, you can't write about individuals. I wanted to try to get at slavery from a different perspective, in a way, from the way that I fell in love with history, and that is to say, thinking about a person and contemplating an individual person's life and the ways in which they're like me, and the ways that people in the past are very, very different from the way we are, but mainly the points of commonality that have been running, a sort of a theme running through human life from the very beginning. So that's what the book is about, and I hope that you will have questions for me, and I will entertain them now. Thank you. Oh, absolutely. He asked me to repeat the questions. That was one question. Yes, I will repeat the questions. The gentleman here. Mm-hmm. As though he's not a child molester? Okay, two questions. There's an association of Hemings descendants. What do they think about my book? And why don't I talk about Jefferson as if he's a child molester? I'll answer the first question first. Yes, there is an association of Hemings descendants. They haven't responded to this particular book. I know some of them. And they responded to the first book, and they're very pleased with it. I mean, so I think they'll find this interesting. There might be some things that they might not care for. I talk a lot about color consciousness among the Hemingses. That is to say, the whole issue of fair-skinned blacks and darker-skinned blacks and so forth. may not like that part, but I'll have to see. Why I don't talk about Jefferson as a child molester is that, you know, we can talk rape as opposed to being a child molester, is that the age of consent in Virginia was 10 in the 1830s. It was 10, and it was raised to 12 in 1824. So people had a very, in other words, that's the age at which, you know, this is for setting statutory rape, right? You know, below which any kind of sex is clear. 10. So there's a different understanding at that time period about children and sex. I tell a story about James Madison, who, when he's 33, is courting a girl who's 15. He met her when she was 12. He begins to court her when she's 15. Jefferson is sort of the matchmaker. He's talking to this girl saying he'd make a good match, you should get married and so forth. And we're sitting here, I'm thinking, you know, 32, he's almost 33 years old, 15. One of Jefferson's best friends, a person that he grew up with, Thomas Mann Randolph Sr., at age 50 married, he was courting her when she was 16, but marries a 17-year-old girl. So a 16-year-old, I mean, from our perspective, I mean, gosh, my daughter's 18, right? And you would be like, you know, you'd be all over somebody who did something like that. But here's the point about thinking, I mean, history is a moral enterprise, and there are lines to be drawn, right? You have to, you don't just say, well, that's how they did things in the past. I mean, and just let every single thing go. But this question of when women were eligible to have sex, I mean, it's just very, very different from what we have today. There's just a different sense of what that meant. I mean, we postpone childbearing today because women have to go to school, they go to college, they have jobs. But in those days, I mean, what were women doing except having a baby? I mean, you're supposed to have babies. So the issue of rape and consent is one thing. The issue of the child molestation is that she would not have thought of herself as a child. He would not have thought of her as a child in the way, because a 16-year-old to me is a baby today. But that's not, I mean, in the average age difference between, you know, marriages between slaves, the man was like 10 years older than the woman. And large age group differences between men and women at that time period were just simply not thought of the way they are today, although it's queasy. I mean, the age of consent, 10? I mean, what could be going through anybody's head? So that's why I don't talk about him in terms of child molestation. From our perspective, that's what it looks like. But child molesters apparently get some thrill out of thinking that they're having sex with a child. If the person doesn't think the person is a child, it isn't the same thing. And he wouldn't have seen it that way. Even though I have a problem with it. I mean, I went to talk to a group of kids at my kids' school, and they were in the 6th grade, and I was wondering how I was kind of tiptoeing around all this, trying to see how I was going to talk about sex, and they were raising their hands saying things like, well, why are you calling this an affair? An affair is when you're married and you're having sex with somebody who's not with me. And I'm sort of sitting there. There's no tiptoeing around these people. And I said, well, you know, the problem is that there's this issue of a master and a slave. If this person is your slave, how does that person say no to you? So people are concerned about that. And the person said, well, you know, if you're the master, I mean, can't you make that person go and work? You know, if you want them to, can't you make them? And I said, well, yes. And I said, okay, well, they're different colors. Well, they didn't really get that. And then they said, well, how old was she? And then I say that, and they go, oh, because you could see them. They were middle schoolers. They were sort of counting up from the time period. And so the age is something that is just sort of real, you know, just stops everybody. But from reading all these stories about these people marrying 15 and 16 and 17-year-old girls, it's just a crazy, it's a time that we just can't even contemplate.
Are there primary sources out there that really explain her emotional ties to Jefferson?
No primary source things out there because we don't have any letters from her. All we can do, I mean, is just say what she did. Certainly, she did not have to come back here with him, but certainly once she gets here, I mean, she's under his control. When she leaves Monticello, she takes pairs of his glasses and shoe buckles, and because they're selling everything at Monticello, it's a fire sale there, and she gives them to her children. as mementos, and there's oral history about them, but no primary. He certainly doesn't talk anything about this, and we don't have anything from her. It's just gestures like that, and what their descendants say about them. But there are no primary documents or anything that talk about what she felt about him or what he felt about her. I mean, it's just something that, I've often said, you have to almost look at it from his perspective as the person who's in control of all of this. There must have been some, people don't usually lust after people for very long. Not for long periods of time. That isn't the typical kind of thing. It isn't the normal kind of, the majority of liaisons or any kind of interactions between a master and slave woman that we typically think of because of the length of it. That's my speculation about that the length of time that he is attached to her suggests that it's not just sex per se, and these are kids who are named for people who were important to him, members of his family. So it's such an odd mindset to try to contemplate that I don't know. I did. John Quincy Adams. I talk about John Quincy Adams in there. John Quincy Adams is a wonderful story. John Quincy Adams wrote for a magazine called The Portfolio occasionally. He wrote these anonymous ballads about Sally Hemings. And when Jefferson is leaving office, he tells the story, and he's mentioning this to his wife. He said, I saw the president. He was in high spirits because he's leaving the office. And we were talking, and Jefferson sort of asked him, so, have you been writing anymore? You still enjoying poetry? And Adams in the letter has poetry underlined because Jefferson knew who had been writing these things, and he wanted Adams to know that he knew it. So he just kind of says, so you still, writing poetry these days? And he goes, no, not so much, and then they just kind of leave it at that. But no, John Quincy Adams wrote poems about Sally Hemings. Some of them, not very funny, some of them funny. But, for some reason, it's something that moves people to verse. Writing poems. You think they were just, there were enough kind of prose stories about it as well, but people wrote songs. It's amazing.
I'm a teacher of history for 20 years. I love Thomas Jefferson. A little older than you are. Bob Fong wrote his book. I haven't read it all. I read all the excerpts out of American Heritage. There was one son, supposedly, that looked so much like Thomas Jefferson that off in the distance, they would call him, they would mistake him for the president.
We don't know. We think it was Eston, though, the youngest one, because Madison Hemings, who left his recollections, was about 5'10", and Eston was about 6'2". And some people who were from Ohio came out to Virginia, and they saw the statue of Jefferson that is at the university, and said, who does that look like? That looks exactly like Eston Hemings. So people think it may have been Eston. But Jefferson's grandson said that all of the sons looked very much like him, but that was because they were the sons of the Carrs, his sister's children, which was entirely plausible. But we don't really know which one it was. But I would imagine that it was probably Eston.
Well, I always kid my department head. I'll never forget her coming to my room with this awful expression on her face and 70s saying, "What are you telling these kids?" And I said, "Hey, it's true. Here it is." But now one thing I haven't not read your book, but I wondered, did you touch anything on the affair or his love life in Paris with I want to say she was an opera singer.
Maria Cosway.
Oh, okay.
She ran off with an opera singer.
Okay. Now the love letters, she asked him not to, Patsy asked Thomas not to remarry and to burn their love letters.
Well, the story from the Hemings family, who found Martha's bedside when she was dying, along with other people as well. That was sort of a pretty stock thing to happen, when the master's dying to bring everybody around. And they said that she asked him not to get married again. Edmund Bacon reports this story. He's Jefferson's overseer. That he asked her not to marry again, not apparently because, she wanted him to herself, even in death, but she was worried about having, she said she did not want another woman over her children. Now, she was the oldest of John Wales's children, and her mother died not long after she was born. And so she had two stepmothers, and we don't really know what the nature of their relationship was. So we don't, I mean, this is the story that is told about it. I mean, but it's a I mean, given that she'd had two stepmothers, and the fact that she gives an explanation, it doesn't sound like it's totally far-fetched. People have done things like that. It seems like a cruel kind of thing to do, but we do know, I mean, he didn't marry again. I mean, she died when he was 39, and he died at 83, and he didn't marry again when it was common for men to get married again. I mean, John Wales had 3 wives, and even, men died as well, and women got remarried. The expectation was that you were supposed to get married. I mean, it's difficult for us to see it because we're kind of looking at these people through the Victorian age, but people in the 18th century did not think that celibacy was a good thing.
Well, wasn't this a pretty common practice between plantation owners?
Yes, it was a common thing. I mean, one of Jefferson's friends who's writing about Jefferson in his diary says that it was common for bachelor or widowed slave owners sometimes to take an enslaved woman on the plantation and he uses the term substitute for a wife. There's another man who, the guy who took down the recollections of Edmund Bacon, whom I mentioned, he was a minister who wrote a memoir about riding circuit, his days riding circuit. And he said it was not, again, this term uncommon, to come upon these farmhouses where white men would be living with black women, sort of housekeepers as their wives. I mean, essentially, that's what it was with kids. And he said, people don't like to say this is common, but it's very common. And that's how you get 45% of African American males in some communities with a European Y male chromosome.
When I did Jefferson's law teacher in Williamsburg,
George Wythe.
Didn't he have
Oh, well, let me answer this, and then people are rumbling in the background. Didn't George Wythe have, well, I don't know, because people assume that George Wythe was Jefferson's law teacher, and he was murdered by his nephew after his nephew found out that he had created a will, leaving all of his property to his housekeeper, who was a black woman, and a boy who was named Michael Brown, who was, in fact, mixed race. But it's not clear that Michael Brown was really his son. I mean, he may have, I mean, he could have been, but it's not clear that he was. But he certainly treated him like a son. He educated him, and he left his money to him, and he asked Jefferson to be his guardian, this young man's guardian, and to educate him. So he loved him like he was a son. But well, no, he died. I mean, the guy killed him. He not only killed George Wythe, he killed Michael Brown as well. I want to go in the back here. Sorry. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Her father was John Wales. Her father was Jefferson's wife's father. So she was Jefferson's wife's half-sister. Sorry. So, did she ever have a husband herself? No. No. As far as we know, she did not have another husband. I mean, he lists in the farm books, he lists people with their families, but she's listed there just with her children. So John Wales is was her father, and so she is 1/4 black.